Welcome, everyone. My name is Gina Dance, and I am a Latina woman who supports reparation. I am also a policy analyst at Rising Communities. Rising Communities is a South Los Angeles nonprofit, community-based health education, advocacy, and policy organization established in 1992 in response to the growing health and healthcare crisis. Rising Communities' mission is to co-develop transformational social equity models and systems in service to BIPOC communities to help each person thrive. Rising Communities is honored to work aside the Coalition for Just and Equitable California, also known as CJEC, to work towards reparation. Welcome to our live reading of the California Reparation Task Force report right here on the Coalition for Just and Equitable California YouTube channel. Readings of the final report by chapter occur every week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific Time on this channel. We use this channel to help inform and educate in your advocacy for our reparations right here in California. CJEC is a California leading grassroots organization born for reparation and reparative justice for Black American freemen living in California. Visit www.cjec-official.org. Sign up for current and accurate California reparation news and info on their Get Involved page, and support their work by volunteering and/or donating. To donate, click on the Donate tab on their homepage of their website. Their website also includes up-to-date and action items for bills that are circulating the California legislature. To make reparations a reality, we need 41 assembly members, 21 senators, and 1 governor. A thank you to CJEC's fiscal sponsor of the California Black Women's Health Project. You can learn more about them by visiting www.cabwhp.org. Another shout out to ETM Media Group for supporting these live readings. Lastly, shout out to CJEC for leading this work. It has been an honor to learn and stand with them. I will be reading chapter 33, which is my favorite chapter because it lays out a plan to educate the public and answers questions around reparations. I personally used some of these answers to explain why reparations are needed. You can follow along in the reading by downloading tonight's chapter by going to CJEC's website. Without further ado, here's chapter 33, Educating the Public and Responses to Questions. Roman numeral 1. AB 3121 charges the task force with recommending appropriate ways to educate the California public of the task force findings. To achieve this goal, the task force consulted academic experts to develop a concept for educating students of all ages and backgrounds, as well as the public in general, through a curriculum designed to make the task force work accessible. The task force recommends that the legislature adopt the concepts discussed herein, which the task force develop with the support of these experts as a standard curriculum. The task force further recommends the legislature fund the implementation of age-appropriate curricula across all grade levels, as well as the delivery of these curricula in schools across California. The legislature should also create a public education fund specifically dedicated to educating the public about African American history and support the initial and ongoing education about the task force findings. Additionally, in order to facilitate continued conversation in communities across California following the publication of this report, the task force has developed materials included within this chapter that will help answer some potential questions people may have about reparation. These questions are expected to come from, and the answers should be responsive to, those who support reparations but want to better understand their justification, those who might be unaware of the need for or purpose of reparations, and those who are opposed to reparations but may benefit from additional information. Roman numeral 2, educating the public. The task force initial efforts to educate the public. In order to educate the public about the significant findings and recommendations contained in this report, the task force engaged in extensive outreach both through its members and through the Ralph J. Bunche Center at UCLA, Bunche Center, as detailed in Chapter 32 of this report. All the task force meetings took place in public, either via video conference platform or through in-person meetings that took place in San Francisco, March 2022, Los Angeles, September 2022, Oakland, December 2022, San Diego, January 2023, Sacramento, March 2023, Oakland, May 2023, and Sacramento, June 2023. All meetings were also live streamed through the California Department of Justice's website. All materials considered by the task force in these meetings were posted on the website hosted by the Department of Justice for the Task Force Administrative Support. You can find that at http://oag.california.gov/AB3121. These materials have included not only drafts of the report components and expert reports considered by task force members to generate the legislative recommendations contained in this report, but also presentations made to the task force by witnesses appearing before it and public comments and emails submitted to the task force email intake portal. Various task force members engaged in community outreach and engagement through national and local news media broadcasts and social media, and appeared on numerous panels and at events addressing the subject matter of the task force work. Following the issuance of the interim report in June 22, the task force received scores of organizational endorsements of the work of the task force, the study of reparations, or both. This support has come from large and small organizations, including social service providers, bar association, civil rights advocates, Professional National Psychological Association, educators and social workers, and in groups representing the faith community. The work of the task force has prompted individuals and organizations to pursue independent public education initiatives, including serial television programs based on the harms chronicled in the report, documentary film projects capturing task force proceedings, findings, recommendations, and remarks by the task force members. The task force anticipates that these projects will contribute to the public's understanding of the reverberating impact of 246 years of enslavement and its lingering effects, and also generate discussions and support for reparations for African Americans in California. Therefore, while these independent projects are neither subject to approval nor endorsed by the task force welcomes and encourages the wide dissemination across multiple platforms of the information contained in this report. The groundbreaking work of the task force, its members, consulting experts, and the attorneys, researchers, and staff of the California Department of Justice Civil Rights Enforcement Section and Research Center has illuminated a history of discrimination and its resulting harms, hereunforth ignored, buried, or willfully forgotten. It is also established the foundation for further educational efforts to make clear the necessity for policies to address such harms and deter their repetition. Principles underpinning a concept to educate the general public. The task force recommends that the legislator continue the development of a curriculum based upon the task force final report for grades 9 through 12 school students. In furtherance of this recommendation, the task force retained two professors, Dr. Travis J. Bristol, an associate professor of teacher education and education policy at the University of California, Berkeley School of Education, and Dr. Tonoli A. Britton, assistant professor of the University of California, Berkeley School of Education, to advise the task force on the structure, components, and process of appropriate curriculum pedagogy. Their feedback provided their basis of which task force formulated the recommendations set forth in this chapter. The development of such curriculum will benefit the public at large, including students in the other states, by teaching a major portion of American history that is largely unknown. For example, chapters 1 through 13 of the report summarizes the harms and lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and discrimination on living African Americans and on society in California and the United States. Chapter 32 further details the legacy of these historical and present-day harms, and chapters 34 through 40 detail the vast extent to which the federal and California laws created a system of subjugation of African Americans as a group and exacerbated lingering material and psychosocial effects of the enslavement and post-enslavement periods. The initial work of Professor Bristol and Britton will focus on grades 9 through 12, but as discussed below, the task force further recommends that the legislator fund the establishment and implementation of standard educational programming at age-appropriate grade levels from early elementary school through college. In addition, the legislator should ensure that the task force final report is circulated as widely as possible in both electronic and paper formats throughout California, including to university and colleges, schools, government bodies, libraries, private organizations, and other institutions, as well as to members of the public. Translated versions should be also available in Spanish and other languages that are frequently used at the state and local level as appropriate. The task force believes that the legislators should be mindful of several important goals in ensuring the public is educated about both the critical historical information contained in the task force report and the task force finding and recommendation. The legislator should also seek to build a collective base of knowledge to inform racially diverse communities and to appeal to different ways of learning. California is an extremely diverse state, and so the task of educating the public should be approached in a manner that will ensure that educational content to be accessible to every California. Few subjects in America are more difficult to discuss, more polarizing, and more prone to misinterpretation than race. Conversations in the absence of factual, historical, and contemporary issues opens the door to increase polarization, misunderstanding, and division. Accordingly, California's educational efforts should be designed to encourage honest, informed conversations about race among the general public in schools, religious institutions, at dinner tables, in boardrooms, and other parts of society. This can inspire reflections and requisite action that supports the more perfect union that has been repeatedly cited as a foundational principle for California and the nation. As documented in the report, the harms to African Americans span centuries. Therefore, the repair should be long in the implementation, involving immediate remedial action, long-standing commitments scaled over years to address the enormous harms and guarantees of non-repetition. Accordingly, broad public education about the task force findings will help effectuate these outcomes. To ensure that this report and its call for reparation is not passing moment to be soon forgotten, the task force recommends that there be consistent messaging to create a common understanding that reparations is fundamentally about justice, one that should matter to all California because it goes to the heart of the ideals that America aspires to embody. Concise statements and simplified messaging should be developed, e.g., through video, infographics, slogans, and taglines to define what reparation means, make this complex and contentious subject matter easier to understand, and reveal that this is an issue in which all Americans should have a vested interest. Public Education Fund. The task force also recommends the legislator create a public education fund specifically designed to educating the public about African American history in the United States and California. One model for such a public education can be found in the Japanese American Incarceration Reparations Commission recommendation of a Civil Liberties Public Education Fund, known as CLPEF, the government-sponsored program that was developed out of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. CLPEF's mission was to educate the public on the issues surrounding wartime incarceration of Americans of Japanese ancestry. In 1996, President Bill Clinton appointed a board of directors to oversee its operations. The CLPEF board's stated mission was to publish and distribute the records of these hearings, findings, and recommendations of the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, known as the CWRIC, so that the events surrounding the exclusion, forced removal, and incarceration of persons of Japanese ancestry would be remembered, and the causes and circumstances of this and similar events illuminated and understood. The CLPEF board was also charged with making disbursements of $5 million in federal funds, a portion which was used to republish the findings of the CWRC. CLPEF also oversees the editing of more than 4,500 pages of transcripts from the CWRC hearings to provide a complete and accessible record for the public's use in understanding what occurred and the rationale for the reparations program implemented at the Commission's recommendation. In addition, $3.3 million was distributed to fund 135 projects, including 18 national fellowships in the areas of curriculum, landmarks, exhibits, art/media, community development, research resources, and national fellowships. Among the diverse recipients from 20 states and the District of Columbia were museums, educational institutions, libraries, artists, theater groups, as well as individuals. Projects range in funding from $2,000 to $100,000. In 1997, CLPEF held a national curriculum summit involving 50 curriculum grant recipients and educators with the goal of integrating lessons learned into a national education curriculum. CLPEF also held a national conference in San Francisco in 1988 to allow grant recipients to share and discuss their projects. Earlier in the same year, CLPEF and the Smithsonian Institution co-sponsored National Day of Remembrance in Washington, D.C. to commemorate President Franklin D. Roosevelt signing of Executive Order 9066 and call national attention to this landmark event. Several public service announcements were also produced with CLPEF funds. After the federal CLPEF expired in 1988, the California Civil Liberties Public Education Fund, known as the CCLPEP, continued and extended the work of the federal effort. CCLPEP sponsored projects to ensure that events surrounding the exclusion, forced removal, and internment of citizens and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry will be remembered, so that the causes and circumstances of this and similar events may be illuminated and understood, In 1988, the Civil Liberties Public Education Act authorized $1 million in state funding to support the development of educational resources about World War II incarceration and the importance of protecting civil liberties even in times of national crisis. Administered by the California State Library, CCLPEP awarded nearly $9 million over 12 years to nonprofit organizations, colleges and universities, public libraries, community groups, teachers, writers, researchers, and artists. Like its federal predecessor, CCLPEP funded a wide variety of projects including books, videos, documentaries or films, curricula, lesson plans, as well as teacher guides and or teacher training sessions, exhibits, collections, or digitization of existing collections, oral histories, artistic works, including poetry, music, and art, installations, conferences, field trips, or other types of special events, academic resources and research, memorials or public honors, and website development. CCLPEP's competitive grant program also supported the creation and dissemination of educational and public awareness resources concerning the history and the lessons of civil rights violation or civil liberties injustices carried out against communities or populations. These included civil right violation or civil liberties injustices perpetrated on the basis of an individual's race, national origin, immigration status, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. The task force recommends the legislator adopt a public education fund model that similarly allows for versatile projects to support public education, including curricula, audiobooks, public arts, displays, literary works, documentary films, student essay contests, seminars, podcasts, and any other media that may be appropriate to educate all California about the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the discrimination described in this report on living African Americans and on society in California and in the United States, and all of the findings and recommendations set forth in this report. One seminal study found that when high school students from historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups that were at risk of dropping out took ethnic studies courses, their attendance rate increased by 21%. Their grade point average increased by 1.4 points, and they earned, on an average, 23 more credits. Ensuring the curriculum benefits the African American community, including descendants of people enslaved in the United States. Not only should an appropriately developed and comprehensive curriculum benefit California children and the public generally, it should also be designed with the goal of specifically educating the African American community, particularly children who are descendants of people enslaved in the United States. Access to a culturally relevant and sustaining curriculum increases the engagement and academic outcomes for students from diverse racial and ethnic groups. For example, one seminal study found that when high school students from historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups that were at risk of dropping out took an ethnic studies course, their attendance rates increased by 21%, their grade point average increased by 1.4 points, and they earned on average 23 more credits. Another study found longer-term benefits for students of color who had been enrolled in ethnic study courses, including that these students had higher rates of attendance and graduation and an increased likelihood of attending college when compared to their peers who didn't have access to an ethnic studies course. While culturally relevant work remains important for all students, this engagement in high school is associated with fewer positive life outcomes such as lower likelihood of high school graduation and college enrollment. Since high school is an important time to prepare students for life and career, Part of this preparation should include curriculum that speaks to both the structural challenges and opportunities that children face. Given the clear and compelling evidence on this short and long-term positive academics impact of culturally relevant curriculum on students of color, there is a particular urgency to develop a curriculum on the historical and contemporary lived experiences of African American students in California. On both academic and non-academic outcomes, African American students perform at lower levels when compared to their peers. For example, in the 2021-2022 school year, only 30% of African American students performed at or above grade level on the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress, known as CAA-SPP literacy assessment, compared to 61% of white students. Similar outcomes disparities arise in the CAA-SPP math assessment, where only 16% of African American students perform at or above grade level compared to 48% of white students. The task force recommends a reparations curriculum. In order to educate California in the findings and recommendation of the task force, and because of the stubborn opportunity gap between African American students and their peers, the task force recommends the legislature fund the development and implementation of a standard curriculum encompassing the contents in the final report. In rendering this recommendation, the task force recognizes that access to curriculum that reflects the diversity of an increasingly interconnected world will allow all of California's children to expand their understanding of our state and nation. The task force recommends that the appropriate curricula be developed across grade level and the initial curriculum be designed for high school students and young adults, followed by curriculum for younger children and one specifically for younger adults in carceral settings. The curricula should also be adapted for use by adults in community popular education aimed at increasing civic engagement. Finally, curriculum should be developed for advanced learning to further the academic study of these issues at the college and university level. The proposed curriculum should be cross-disciplinary and seek to connect history, literature, math, and science, as the final report details the breadth of the harms that needs to be understood by the public. The curriculum should include lessons on reparations that can be embedded in existing required high school coursework. The task force recommends the following detailed design plan, developed in consultation with the task force educational curriculum expert Dr. Travis J. Bristow and Dr. Toloni A. Britton. The initial steps requires selection of specific lead curriculum designers who have a clear sense of their scope of the curriculum. Those lead and their selected teams should conduct a landscape analysis of existing Black and African American study high school curricula. This should include extensive engagement with teachers and community programs that have developed and are delivering coursework on Black and African American studies and or reparation. The planning team should execute a brainstorming day in which consultation groups come together to share curriculum design ideas based on existing reparation lessons and workshops and do begin the collective design process. During the process, the team should consider all ideas, including unique and novel ones. Following this initial process, the design teams should develop a draft outline and model curriculum with the lead curriculum co-designers. Using high school as an example, the outline should differentiate content across grade levels 9 through 12. The team should design essential questions based on each chapter of the reparations report, appropriate for grades 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. The team should then scope the sequence, the curricular units based on each chapter of the report as appropriate for grades 9/10 and 11/12. Finally, the team should ensure the essential questions cut across contact areas and align to Common Core state standards. In order to test the conceptual product, the design team should run one or more 1 week curriculum institutes, both virtually and in person, to define the outline of the model curriculum with various groups of teachers, students, and community-based educators. The participants should be surveyed about the process and contents of the curriculum, and the lead team should meet to review the results, assess progress and feasibility, and assess the remainder of the process. Following the completion of the preliminary concept development, the lead team of curriculum co-designers should proceed with working with selected teachers, students, and community-based educators to pilot activities related to the implementation and real-world testing of the model curriculum and collect lessons example for each contact area across grades 9/10 and 11/12. The lead team should convene smaller work group of teachers based on grade and subjects taught. These groups should meet at least 3 times per semester. The smaller work groups and the larger group of teachers, students, and community-based educators should have one or more dedicated meetings that include design time and feedback loops and smaller groups based on the grade and subjects taught in order to fine-tune the contents and deployment of the curriculum. This process should be followed by further demonstration and test sessions, both virtually and in person, to solicit feedback for curricular contexts for grades 9/10 and 11/12 from students, community-based educators, school-based teachers, parents, and administrators. The design team should develop assessments based on student work from the test period for curricular content across the content areas for grades 9/10 and 11/12. Following the development of the curriculum using this model recommended by the task force, the design team should produce a report detailing the methodology for the development of the curriculum and make the curriculum widely available. The task force recommends that the legislator hold hearings at an appropriate time to study the development and context of the curriculum, and subject to the legislator's findings with regard to the curriculum, fund and overview encourage its implementation across the state. Roman numeral 3, responses to questions about the task force reparation proposals. With any major initiative such as reparations, it is natural that there would be questions from members of the public, whether supporting, opposing, or simply seeking answers about reparations. The following are anticipated questions and responses to concerns that members of the public may have about reparations for African Americans in the state of California. This section is not intended to be exhaustive. Instead, the task force offers it as a perspective to contribute to a developing national public dialogue and to encourage these difficult and essential conversations in the homes of every American. The answers provided here are intended to ensure that there are clear responses to challenges to reparation, as well as to help facilitate these conversations. Question: California was a free state, not a slave state. Why should it be responsible for reparations at all? Even though California entered the Union in 1850 as a free state, the state government at the time nonetheless permitted it and committed grave injustices against African Americans and allowed its residents to enslave African Americans. These injustices, which all took place in California, included enslavement, legal public and private segregation, discrimination in state funding and programming, and stigmatization that upheld a white supremacist racial hierarchy that remains in place to this day. California Fugitive Slave Law. California passed and enforced a fugitive slave law, and some scholars estimated that up to 1,500 enslaved African Americans lived in California in 1852. In fact, numerous enslavers who actively supported the Confederacy moved to California before and during the Civil War and brought with them or sent ahead the persons they enslaved, and saw as their chattel property to work on farms and ranches and to mine gold on their behalf. Some of these individuals established leadership roles in the young state. For example, Confederate John LeConte, a physicist who employed his scientific knowledge to make gunpowder for the Confederate Army, was UC Berkeley's first acting president. Enslaved people labored under violent conditions, and even free African Americans lived under racist laws that restricted their rights and rendered them vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Thus, California bears direct responsibility for atrocities that occurred during the enslavement era, which can be redressed through comprehensive reparations. California and the 14th and 15th Amendments. Enslavement, even with all its atrocities and horrors, is far from the lone basis for the case for reparations at either the national or state level. Post-enslavement atrocities, as detailed in this report, are a critical dimension for the justification for reparations. For example, during Reconstruction, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which promised equal rights for all citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying a person's right to vote on the basis of race. California did not ratify these amendments until 1959 and 1962, respectively. California and the Ku Klux Klan. After slavery ended in 1865, Jim Crow found a home in California. For example, in the 1920s, California became a strong Klan state, with a sizable Ku Klux Klan presence in Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. Housing segregation. In the decades that follow enslavement, the federal, state of California, and local governments acted with private actors to create and intensify housing segregation. Government actions intertwined with private actions and segregated America, leading to enormous wealth disparities, environmental harms, unequal education and health outcomes, vast wealth differentials, and over-policing of African American neighborhoods in California and across the nation that all continue to this day. For example, California allowed extensive use of racially restrictive covenants, which are widely used throughout the state. According to the 1973 U.S. Commission on the Civil Rights Report, by 1940, 80% of homes in Los Angeles contained restrictive covenants barring African American families from owning homes. Some of these covenants remain a part of public record. From 1937 to 1948, more than 100 lawsuits attempted to enforce covenants and evict African American families from their homes in Los Angeles. In other words, while California was a free state, it was deeply complicit with the institution of slavery and active participant in perpetuating its badges and incidents. Further, in the decades that followed, the state implemented laws and policies infected with racism that flowed from the institution of enslavement, targeting African American people. These laws and policies continue to have an effect, as they have resulted in the cumulative, compounding, and cascading intergenerational harm experienced by African Americans in California today. Question. The United States fought a civil war to end enslavement and implemented Reconstruction programs. Why was that not enough to address the harms caused by the practice? Enslavement was foundational to the creation of the United States. For 246 years, the United States had built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world, with almost 4 million enslaved people, and cotton was an economic engine that powered the nation. The Constitution protected enslavement and gave southern states outsized political power. Half the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office. More than 1,800 congressmen representing 40 states once enslaved African Americans. Merely ending enslavement did not provide reparations for enslavement. The Civil War did not provide compensation for the atrocities committed on enslaved persons before the war. Additionally, the emancipation for those who were enslaved could have been achieved without the war, as proposed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862. Further, white people alone did not deliver freedom. African Americans fought beside them in Union Army and risked their lives to emancipate themselves. At the end of the Civil War, Congress seized land from wealthy Southerners, intending to distribute 40 acres to each formerly enslaved person to address the harms of slavery. In January 1865, 400,000 acres in South Carolina and Georgia were deeded in 40,000 formerly enslaved persons who settled on and worked on that land. But by April of 1865, President Lincoln had been assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency and soon declared, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be government for white men." President Johnson rescinded the land reparations program, ordered the black settlers off the land they owned, and returned it to former enslavers. In the end, 4 million men, women, and children across the nation were released from enslavement without acknowledgement, apology, compensation, or resources. There were no meaningful or lasting changes to laws, institutions, or systems, and there were none of the requisite legal, medical, psychological, and other care and services. All of the disparities detailed in this report result directly from the subjugation of African Americans during slavery and the comprehensive legal, political, financial, and social systems established thereafter to maintain the oppression of African Americans and their descendants. Moreover, there were the harms visiting on those living at the time of an emancipation. Many thousands did not live to see emancipation. And for the descendants of those who were enslaved, 90 years of legal segregation and subjugation followed, during which California was an active participant in the exclusionary laws and practices that swept the nation. Legal segregation in the United States ended only about 50 years ago, but its effects have been a lasting and devastating impact, and there has been no meaningful repair. Question. Since the Civil War, the United States and California have both implemented many programs to try to foster equality, especially in housing, education, and government programs. Why do we need reparations and more policy changes when we already have done so much? While many programs have been implemented following emancipation, as discussed in the report, most, if not all of them, benefited non-African American people of color or even white people more than they benefited African Americans, much less descendants of formerly enslaved persons or formerly enslaved persons themselves. In fact, beginning with the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave over 1 million white households 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories, all the way through the expansion of government assistance programs during the 1930s New Deal era, government programs consistently excluded African Americans. Today, the majority of recipients of government assistance are white. Specifically, with regard to welfare, these types of programs do not address the group-specific harms directed at descendants of enslaved persons or African American community more generally, nor were they so intended. They do not pay the debt owed for unpaid labor, nullification of generational wealth, production, denial of humanity, creation of permanent slave race status, an ever-present psychological state of terror, and impending threat and doom, and a state of perpetual anti-blackness with no recognized social existence. With respect to housing and education, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s when the wholesale exclusion of African Americans from equal education, employment, and the benefits of the New Deal, like federally insured home loans, deprived them of choices as fundamental as where they would live. The opportunities that created America's white middle class, resulting in households having 9 times more assets than African American households, have simply never been accessible to African American community. The cumulative, unremitting impact of centuries of anti-Black laws, the policies led this country to where we stand today, with African Americans having shorter life expectancies than the rest of the population. African American women dying at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women from complications related to pregnancy or childbirth, and huge persistent disparities in every aspect of American life, from individuals experiencing homelessness to policing. All these disparities result not only from the subjugation of African Americans during enslavement, but also from the comprehensive legal, political, financial, and social systems established therefore after to maintain the oppression of African Americans and descendants. Similarly, affirmative action was not intended to be reparations. Affirmative action policies developed as an anti-discrimination measure to create opportunities for unjustly excluded groups whose members could not gain entrance despite their qualifications and merit. It does not compensate for keeping those groups out in the past. Furthermore, affirmative action alone cannot eliminate the black-white wealth inequality, which is the main goal of reparations. Affirmative action programs have also been very limited, and they have failed to remedy the gross disparities and discrimination in employment, housing, wealth, and income to which African Americans continue to be subjected. Finally, since the passage of Proposition 209 in 1996, governmental affirmative action has not existed in California for more than 25 years. Question. The United States is a nation of self-made success in which lots of people have suffered harms but have not looked to the government to solve their problems. Why should the government step in here to address these issues? This is simply not true. When people have been victimized, when tragedy strikes, and when a large group of people are collectively impacted by an event, the government has stepped in numerous times to provide reparations in the form of compensation paid for a harm suffered. For example, the federal and state governments have compensated farmers, fishermen, veterans, people exposed to pesticides and other toxic chemicals, miners affected by black lung disease, and those whose properties have been damaged in a natural disaster. Those reparation programs seem to find wide acceptance by the public, including those not affected by the underlying harm. In addition, when someone commits a crime, the state requires that restitution be paid by the offender. However, when it comes to harms that the state commits, accountability is exceptionally rare. This is a form of denying those who are wrong the right to repair. The federal government has and continues to engage in restitution initiatives and pay compensation to many others, but not African Americans. Some relatively recent examples discussed in Chapter 15 include payments to Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II, families who lost loved ones during September 11th, 2001 terrorist attack, 47 of whom were from California, the victims of the Boston Marathon bombings, and Americans taken hostage in Iran, 4.4 million per person for the 444 days they were held hostage. Morality also compels California to make reparations. Every act of injustice necessitates the duty of atonement. American society, including California society, rests upon a financial foundation of centuries of the stolen labor of enslaved Africans. The nation and state continue to benefit from the stolen lives and labor of millions of African Americans. The bedrock document of American government and society, the federal Constitution, embraced slavery. The deprivation of freedom, extraction of free labor from enslaved persons, and countless other atrocities committed upon African Americans since 1619 have not been repaired. California has never atoned for its role in the horror of slavery and its badges and incidents. Question. Enslavement and its enduring effects are a national responsibility. Why should California, rather than the federal government, engage in reparations instead of waiting for the federal government to act? Response. The debt that is owed to African Americans belongs to all of the United States, including California. Although the federal government and other states have thus far forsaken this debt and failed to take any meaningful steps to redress it, that does not give California a free pass, particularly for wrongs committed by California. On the contrary, when others fail to act, it's even more important for those committed to the American ideals of liberty and justice for all to fulfill their moral duty. Governments can and often do step in to acknowledge grievous wrongs and help alleviate the pain for those who have suffered, even when they have not directly caused all the harm suffered. The federal government, for example, undertook reparatory efforts following the terrorist attack of September 11th, the mass shooting of children at Sandy Hook Elementary, and the Iran hostage crisis, all despite not being the party directly responsible. California has the same power to provide repair for African Americans in our state in the face of federal inaction, and particularly with recent to historic and modern-day harms against African Americans perpetrated by California. An even stronger moral imperative exists to acknowledge and redress the injustices and injury experienced by African Americans in California. California stepping in the breach no less diminishes the responsibility of the federal government. The harms meted out against African Americans resulted from national and local collusion. While California has a clear responsibility to make reparations as detailed in this report, the task force strongly believes that the federal government has a duty to engage in national reparations effort, aside from the need for a uniform and equal reparations program across the country. Federal reparations could also be more far-reaching with the resources of the federal government. For example, the combined budgets of all the state and local governments in the country amount to around $3.5 trillion, which the federal government annually spends about $6 trillion. Question. The task force recommendations would benefit descendants in California, even if their ancestors lived and or were enslaved in other states. Why should California be responsible for reparations for people who migrated from other states? Response. First, through enactment and enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, California was responsible for the re-enslavement of and forced relocation of African Americans to other states. Thus, California bears complicity in and responsibility for many California descendants whose ancestors were enslaved in or in other states, as California forced many of those ancestors back into enslavement in those other states. Second, while reparations are rooted first and foremost in enslavement, California, like other states, sanctioned racial terror and discrimination following emancipation. California used its legal and authoritative framework to ensure that the badges and incidents of enslavement persisted without remedy, profiting in the process. Consequently, even if Californian descendants had ancestors who were enslaved in other states, when those descendants of their ancestors became Californians, they experienced the continued badges and incidents of slavery and lingering discrimination that California perpetrated, as documented through chapters 1 through 13 of this report. Question. If California is taking responsibility for atrocities that took place outside of California and providing reparation for those whose families lived outside of California, why not also provide reparation for those whose ancestors suffered the same atrocities, but outside of the United States? Response. A case can be made that the United States should pay reparations to descendants of persons who were enslaved in other locations that were part of the Atlantic slave trade, also known as the Triangle Trade, as well as those who died during the brutal forced passage to Americans during this period. The task force strongly urges any government that benefited from the historical blight on humanity to make reparations for the same type of atrocities detailed in this report. However, this task force charged with making recommendations to the California legislature regarding a reparations program operated by the state of California. To that end, the task force voted to limit eligibility to Californians who were able to trace the lineage to being African American descendants of chattel enslaved person or descendants of a free African American living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century. This decision reflects AB 3121's direction in the task force and the task force judgment that California's moral obligation extends first and foremost to those within the community of eligibility. The focus on descendants of African Americans, enslaved persons, or free persons in the United States is therefore warranted because California played a more direct role in the commission of the atrocities and harms to the ancestors of those community members than it did to others who were similarly harmed by the enslavement beyond the borders of the United States. Question. The task force final report documents how African Americans as a group have been subjected to intergenerational harm upon the present. Why limit monetary reparations only for those within the eligible class? Response. The UN principles on reparations include 5 forms of reparations: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. Reserving monetary reparations, including monetary equivalent reparations such as free tuition or loan forgiveness or restitution for the eligible class, is appropriate since restitution's central purpose in the reparation context is to endeavor to restore victims to the status that they would have had in the absence of the atrocities suffered. The harm here can never be undone, but to the extent financial reparations can seek to restore victims to their prior status, this decision was made to trace reparations payments back to those who suffered the original harm, to the lives taken, the labor stolen, the families destroyed, the bodies and souls brutalized and dehumanized. The task force has accordingly recommended this harm-based approach. But to reserve monetary reparation to those who are descended from enslaved persons does not require ignoring the ongoing harm to the larger African American community that can be addressed by changes in policy. As set forth in chapters 1 through 13 of this report, African Americans in California across the United States have continued to experience myriad harms and atrocities that are direct result of a system in place since the time of chattel slavery, including legal segregation and government discrimination designed to suppress, exploit, exclude, and subjugate African Americans on the basis of race. As the international law framework for reparations and AB 3121 both recognize, the community of persons who are considered victims of the system is broad and inclusive of those who continue to suffer from a unremitting legacy of enslavement. Through the changes to laws and policies recommended in chapters 18 through 30 to address the harms that persist and extend to all African American Californians, these legislative reforms are no less essential to reparation but take a different form of satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition beyond monetary repayments or restitution. Question. People of color of all different ancestries have suffered numerous harms throughout California's and United States history. Why should African Americans, and even more specifically the eligible class, get reparations while others do not? Response. AB 3121 created the task force to study and develop reparation proposal for African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. As conveyed by the task force name, the legislator's specific charge to the task force was to study and develop reparation proposal for African Americans to address the lingering harms flowing from the institution of slavery, as well as the de jure and de facto discrimination against freed slaves and their descendants from the end of Civil War to the present, including economic, political, and educational and social discrimination. This is a mandate assigned to and carried out by the task force. While other people have suffered harms, the experience of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of legal segregation and racial terror, and decades more of systemic subjugation and exclusion is unique to African Americans and without near equivalence, resulting in persistent, lingering consequences today. Making reparation to African Americans for the incomparable atrocities suffered by their ancestors and for harms that have been persistent need to not be exclusion of reparation for other groups that have endured harms, but also warrant reparations under international law. Our history to date, however, is that African Americans have repeatedly been promised and then denied their humanity in reparations. Promises have been made beginning with 40 acres and a mule, running through separate education facilities are inherently unequal, and even to the present day that have been broken. As the examples discussed in Chapter 15, examples of other reparatory efforts and the history of reparation movements in the United States demonstrate that the United States and others have provided reparations, however imperfectly, for a host of harms, and yet African Americans continue to be left behind, having received no reparations from the federal government, nor from any state for enslavement, nor for the extensive pattern of government-sanctioned race-based discrimination, subjugation they have suffered. Moreover, reparations need not be a zero-sum game. Just as there have been numerous reparatory initiatives prior to this report, the cases for redress for others can and should be made. The task force hopes this report and the implementation of the recommendations by the legislator can serve as a model for future efforts. But for example, just as the 1988 Japanese American Mass Incarceration Reparations Commission was not asked to account for reparation for others wrongly incarcerated, so too does this task force focus need to remain on the task at hand. Question. Other groups of people endured specific harms in California, such as railroad workers and miners from China, and indigenous individuals subjected through the mission system. Why prioritize reparations in California for African Americans? Response. To prioritize reparation for African American Californians is not to prioritize African Americans Californians over others. It's to begin a long overdue process of acknowledging, atoning for, and seeking to repair a historic wrong that has persisted for over 400 years. And California has taken steps to acknowledge and atone for other states' sins. Some of those efforts are outlined in Chapter 15. Examples of other reparatory efforts in the history of reparations movement in the United States. Undoubtedly, there is more work to be done and more harms to others that warrant repair, and the task force hopes that this report can provide a model for others' efforts to examine and redress the harms others have suffered in California and the United States. Question. Enacting reparations in California could potentially cost California residents a lot of money. But neither I nor my family ever enslaved anyone. So why should we have to take responsibility for reparation for African Americans? Response. Reparations is a collective debt. As a democracy, we share an individual and collective obligation to the common good. As we reap the benefits of democracy, so too do we incur its obligation and liabilities. And while African Americans are among those who cherish most American democratic ideals associated with the common good, they have been among those least likely to benefit from these ideals. The nation was enriched not only by 2 and 1.5 centuries of forced free labor from generational enslavement, but also by the iterations of racial exclusion that continue for more than 100 years thereafter into the present day. California's white population, business interests, and leaders reaped enormous economic, political, and social advantages by separating the state into devolved African American neighborhoods and enhance value white neighborhoods by excluding African Americans from the rights, benefits, and opportunities available to its white residents. This wealth was achieved at an incalculable long-term cost to African Americans, resulting in huge and growing disparities for them in income, wealth, housing, health outcomes, and life expectancy, education, and other crucial metrics as noted below. Reparations is not a handout. It's not welfare. As detailed in this report, reparation is in recognition of a debt owed from a cumulative, compounding, and lingering effects of stolen lives, wages, property, opportunities, protection, and government benefits. This is a debt African Americans have been trying to collect on since 1898, when Callie House and Rev. Isaiah Dickerson launched their first mass-based reparations movement in the United States. It's a debt imposed upon the United States by the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which stipulates that the United States has an obligation to eliminate all forms of relics of slavery, an obligation that the United States has failed to satisfy. Moreover, the debt is a collective one, just as one other societal debts that our nation incurred years, decades, or even more than a century ago, such as from wars, public work projects, natural disasters, and human-caused wrongs, pension and social security disbursements, and other entitlements. For example, an Associated Press analysis in 2013 of federal payment records found that the government is still making monthly payments to relatives of the Civil War veterans 148 years after the conflict ended. Ironically, the first to receive reparation post-emancipation were slaveholders, while the formerly enslaved and their descendant efforts for compensatory justice were dismissed, evaded, stalled, or outright refused at every turn. Adding to the collective nature of this unpaid debt is that reality that every situation with some degree of history in America, be it public, be it private, has a history of extracting wealth and resources out of the African American community. Finally, American law established a general principle that taxpayers are liable for the acts of our government officials acting under the protection of law, and corporations are liable for the action taken by their employee on behalf of the corporation. Among the liabilities we have incurred a society in repairing damage done to African Americans by the U.S. federal and state government. As a democracy that prides itself on truth and justice, reparation is simply an act in which America honors its debt to African America, a long overdue debt to which Americans have defaulted on the promissory. Dr. King goes further, stating, instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come marked insufficient funds. Question: the historical impact of racial discrimination and its present-day consequences. Some have argued that white hostility has been more important than black self-determination in the history of the country. The Civil War ended enslavement of African Americans in 1865, but the South was determined to reinstate laws that closely approximated it. And no wonder, for 264 years, the U.S. has built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The enslaved population of the United States was almost 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine reaping profit for the entire country. The nation's constitution protected enslavement and gave southern states outsized political power. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office, and more than 1,800 congressmen representing 40 states once enslaved African Americans. California did not protect African Americans from enslavement. While California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved. From 1852 to 1855, the California legislature passed fugitive slave laws allowing anyone accused of escaping enslavement to be chased down dragged before the court and sent back to the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California. California compromised African Americans' right to vote and equal protection under the law. During the 12-year period from 1865 to 1877 called Reconstruction, when Congress sought to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, ostensibly guaranteeing the equal protection of laws. 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, ostensibly prohibiting states from discriminating against voters on the basis of race. But California officials openly refused to abide by the 15th Amendment. California's Attorney General instructed county clerks not to register African Americans voters until Congress passed legislation commanding them to do so. It would take California nearly another decade to change its constitution in 1879 to partly conform to the 15th Amendment's requirements, and nearly another century to formally ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments in 1959 and 1962, respectively. California allowed African Americans to be terrorized because of their race. Much of the legal segregation found its way into California. White supremacy groups flourished in the West, and in the 1920s, California became a strong Klan state with sizable Klan chapter 83 emerging in San Francisco, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. California did not protect African Americans' housing rights. While the harms suffered by African Americans as a result of racial discrimination are too numerous to mention here, California's history of housing discrimination is a stark example of devastating impact today for Californians' African American residents. Bullet point 1. Between 1839 and 1945, the Homeowners Loan Corporation created maps to guide lenders of home mortgages. These maps rated neighborhoods from A for the best neighborhood to D, the worst neighborhoods. Grade A was shaded in green, and the maps assigned to blocks and neighborhoods that were new and all white. Grade B was shaded in blue and were assigned to stable, outlying Jewish and white working class neighborhoods. Grade C, shaded in yellow, was for inner city neighborhoods bordering mostly African American communities or neighborhoods that had already had a small African American population. Grade D, shaded in red, was the worst category and reserved for all African American neighborhoods, even if it was middle class. The process was called redlining. Historians generally agree that redlining resulted in the devaluation of African American homes across the entire country, making it difficult for African Americans to buy, build, and renovate their homes. Consequently, the redlining maps of yesterday correspond with many of California's most segregated, impoverished, undisturbed, and polluted neighborhoods of today. Bullet point 2. The Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped millions of mostly white Americans buy houses while refusing the same opportunity to African Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loan, creating America's middle class, 98% of which went to white people, thereby depriving African Americans from being able to accumulate and pass on generational wealth. Bullet point 3. California was a leader in racially restrictive covenants. By 1940, 80% of homes in Los Angeles contained racially restricted covenants bearing African Americans. Bullet point 4. Racial exclusionary policies enhanced the value of white neighborhoods and diminished the value of African American ones. Sub-bullet point. City officials zone African Americans residential communities as commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character. This created a vicious cycle. African American residential communities zoned as a commercial or industrial attracted polluting industries and lowered property values. While families would be less likely to move into industrial zones as white families generally had more money. Second bullet point, sub bullet point. The construction of freeways, subways, and commercial and upscale residential developments and parks that led to vast increases in regional productivity and wealth were often disproportionately routed through African American neighborhoods, disposing residents of their homes and businesses. One study in 2007 found that between 1949 and 1973, 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities displaced a million people, 2/3 of whom were African Americans. Sub bullet point, in 1954, Los Angeles destroyed the prosperous African American neighborhood of Sugar Hill by the Interstate 10 freeway. Sub bullet point, in 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 African American residents being displaced and 883 African businesses destroyed. Reckoning with the consequences of 400 years of racial discrimination, the task force was charged with revealing the extent of America's, including California's, collective debt resulting from racial discrimination. As noted, the introduction of this report, the effects of California's compounding government and private acts of racial violence and discrimination have resulted in disparities between African American Californians and white Californians in almost every corner of life. First bullet point. Income disparities. In 2018, on average, African American Californians earned $53,565 compared to $87,078 for white Californians. And around 19.4% of African American Californians live below the poverty line compared to 9% of white Californians. African American Californians are also far less likely to own a home than white Californians. In 2019, 59% of white households owned their homes, compared with 30% of African American Californians. In fact, African American homeownership in California in the 2010s have been lower than in the 1960s, with settlers could still legally discriminate against them. Second bullet point, wealth disparities. Today, white American households continue to be far less to hold assets, and the type of assets they hold are worth on average more than those of African American households. In 2019, the total financial assets of white households had a value more than 9 times higher than those of African American households. The median African American household wealth was approximately $24,100, while median white household wealth was approximately $188,200, a difference of $1,640,100. Housing disparities. The burden of houselessness falls heaviest on African American Californians. Nearly 40% of California's unhoused people are African Americans, even though they represent only 6% of the state populations. Last bullet point. Life expectancy disparities. In 2021, in African American California's life expectancy is 6 years shorter than the state average. African American babies in California are more likely to die in infancy, and African American California mothers giving birth die at a rate of almost 4 times higher than the average California mother. Compared with white Californians, African American Californians are more likely to have diabetes, to die from cancer, or to be hospitalized for heart disease. These disparities resulting from continuing patterns and practices of racial exclusion call upon us as Californians to remember that each time America is owed up to its collective wrongs, repair them, and become more inclusive and more faithful to its ideals. Our nation and our state has become stronger, better, and more perfect union. With no amount of money can compensate for 400 years of humiliation, dehumanization emotional distress and trauma, vice versa reparations. African Americans are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee a future for their children. And pages 961 to 963 provide endnotes to what has been shared in chapter 33. And I just would like to thank CJEC for hosting this space for those to listen to the California Reparations Task final report. We stand with CJEC to continue this fight for reparations. Thank you.